About to get started. You all can take a seat. Okay. Hi, Marcus Epstein. I'm the founder of the Taft Club. I want to thank you all for making it in despite all the perilous weather conditions. A lot of you people are new, and so I want to tell you a little bit about the Taft Club. The club was started by myself, Richard Spencer, who's back there, Dan McCarthy, and Kevin Deanna, who's over there. And it was basically started by us about a year ago, almost 2 years ago, to put on panels in the DC area on topics that we felt aren't properly addressed by other people in DC. So we have a kind of corny but appropriate slogan, which is outside the Beltway thinking, inside the Beltway. And we generally we call ourselves pretty much a hodgepodge of people who are generally unhappy with the mainstream conservative movement, or at the very least were unhappy with the Republican Party before it started losing elections. And we put on panels about 5 times a year, and this is a completely self-supporting group. Memberships, if anyone would be interested in joining, are $10 for students, $25 for young professionals, $50 for professionals, and then of course we have the super memberships, which are $100 for supporters, and $250 for shorter memberships. And this is what keeps us going. Another thing, if you'd like to give us money, is our good friend Howard Seymour back there is going to be hosting a Christmas party for us, which will cost $100 or $50 if you remember, but there is limited space. He doesn't have the.
That's a holiday party.
Yes, a holiday party. Okay, Kwanzaa, Ramadan, Diwali, and all those great things. So please get in touch with one of us if you'd be interested in joining or helping us out. And with that said, I'm just going to introduce our panel. This panel is on the topic Darwin, genetics, and conservatism, friend or foes. A lot of people, when they think of this topic of evolution, they think it's just on one hand you have these Christian fundamentalists who believe that, the world was created in 6 days, and then you have, in the middle, you might have people who believe in evolution but think that God had a hand in it, and then you have extreme secularists on the other hand, and certainly there are people who believe in all three of those things. But when it comes to politics, there are lots of different implications, which are beyond kind of the simple issues of religion and secularism. One group of people who John L. Sullivan dubbed evolutionary conservatives look to issues like sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, which I'm sure some of the speakers will elucidate you on a little bit more, which they believe will shadow some notions about egalitarianism and the blank slate, and certainly the reaction to James Watson, the discoverer of the DNA, when he talked about the possibility of genetic intelligence differences, at least shows that whether or not it's conservative, it's something that many in the left don't like. At the same time, there are a lot of other conservatives who are very critical of Darwinism, not just on religious grounds, but because they believe that in many ways it's become a false god for the left and other people who really believe that all issues come down to Darwinism. There's certainly a Darwinian left, which is what Peter Singer calls it, which kind of uses Darwin to create their own left-wing views. And then there's just a general view that people, both on the left and right, use science, evolution being a major one, as kind of the basis of all of their views. And I'm sure that the speakers will talk about all these immediately, so I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they begin. And our first speaker is John Derbyshire, who is a contributing editor to National Review. And maybe we can
Sorry?
sorry.
That's it.
Okay.
Yes, oh, okay.
So the author of Crime Obsession. And,
Yes, I'm the author of various books.
Various books, yes. Okay.
Do you want me to speak now?
Yes.
Oh, all right. I hope.
Yeah.
First of all, can everybody hear me? Oh, good. Well, first of all, I'm going to I'm going to do what that pop singer did, I think it was Bono, and ask you to give me some money. I did a very dumb thing. Coming here, I left my wallet in a cab. I come down from New York, so I'm penniless and credit cardless. So if anybody would like to lend me some money, wrapped in a piece of paper with your name and address on it, I'll send it right back to you as soon as I get back to New York, but otherwise I'm in a pickle.
You need a drink right now.
I've had a couple of drinks. I'm over it, but I still need the money. I'm going to begin with a little act of courtesy, I hope. I've argued these issues before with Tom Bethell in the room, and Tom has taken umbrage at my calling him a creationist. Or else he's taken umbrage at my conflating creationism with the new doctrines of intelligent design. Naturally, I'm vexed when anyone takes umbrage at anything I say. So I thought the best way to remove this particular irritant in our exchanges was to think of some other way to refer to people who don't like poor old Charles Darwin. I think I've come up with a solution. I don't actually mix much with people who cleave to intelligent design or creationism. Bill Buckley has sometimes expressed some doubts as to the truths of modern biology, or what he and Tom would call Darwinism. Very peculiar usage. Do you refer to electromagnetic theory as Maxwellism? Is modern geology veganism? Is cosmology Hubbleism?
Lots of people call that.
Is quantum mechanics Schrödingerism? But anyway, let's not get rancorous here. Let's eschew rancor. In any case, when the subject comes up, and I'm generally among people who have much less acquaintance with these things than I do, they ask me, what's it all about? What are these creationists, these intelligent design people, what do they want? What's their point? And when you've been asked something a few dozen times like that, you work out a stock reply. And the stock reply that I have worked out is, well, I think what it's really about is human exceptionalism. Most of the people who don't like Darwin want human beings to be exceptional. They want us to be a special creation. Not necessarily a religious one, although in practice it usually works out that way, but they are human exceptionalists. And I'm going to do Tom the courtesy of dropping the word creationist altogether. And I can't even think of a word to describe people who believe in intelligent design. What do you say, intelligent designists? I mean, it just doesn't work. So I'm going to call the opposition here human exceptionalists. People who believe in human exceptionalism, that human beings are something metaphysically separate from the rest of creation. And I do think, having debated anti-Darwinians before, this is the key point for them. I don't really believe that anti-Darwinians are upset about Darwin having told us that modern horses evolved from a little thing like a sort of dog. I don't think they're really upset about that. What they're really upset about is that human beings evolved from lower forms. So I'm going to do Tom the courtesy of referring to him, I hope he won't mind, and if he does I'm sure he'll tell me, as an exceptionalist. Having declared that little act of courtesy and stated the terms on which we should discuss this, now I'm going to play my contrarian card, the one that ticks off Andrew Ferguson so much, and say right up front that it seems to me secondary whether or not human exceptionalism is a key underpinning of conservatism. That's a secondary issue. The primary issue is it so? Is it the case? If it is the case, that's fine. If it's not the case, and it's not being the case is bad for conservatism, then so much the worse for conservatism. Truth value comes first. I don't believe in noble lies. Well, there are such things as noble lies, but I don't believe in them as an organising principle for society. Either human exceptionalism is the case, or it's not the case. If it's not the case, and that's bad for conservatism, then so much the worse for conservatism. Truth comes first. The problem is, of course, that this is not a matter on which truth can be easily settled. There are, in fact, some good arguments for human exceptionalism, and most major philosophers have made them. Aristotle thought that we were exceptional by virtue of possessing reason. Personally, I think that Hume dealt with that very nicely, but there are still some grounds for thinking that we are a special creation. I would put forward two grounds myself for favouring human exceptionalism. One, morality, in that we are the only creature who is in any kind of consistent way moral. We're the only creature who knows what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao. And the other one I would say is language. We're the only creature with well-developed language abilities. Most people, I think, if I said that to them, I think most of you would say, well, morality is the big one and language is the secondary one. Actually, I don't think so. I think if you look at animal studies, higher animals form bonds of affection and loyalty. They defer gratification of their appetites. They refrain from killing each other. They leave each other's females alone. And they even seem to be capable of some rough notion of property rights. Now, of course, they don't always behave well towards each other, but neither do we. So I think morality is actually the lesser problem here. It's not preposterous that our moral sense might have developed from natural processes of fitness advantage leading to differential reproductive success, a la Charles Darwin. Evolutionary psychologists have suggested very plausible ways in which things like altruism and self-sacrifice and group solidarity might have evolved. We don't know that their explanations are true, but at least they're not preposterous. And it's quite possible that we shall soon know whether they're true. As we dig deeper and deeper into the human genome, the unknown will gradually yield to the known. Language is actually a feature of human exceptionalism that's a bit more difficult to cope with, in my opinion. If you look at the sheer complexity of human language compared with the best that we've been able to squeeze out of even the highest animals, even our closest relatives on the tree of life, it brings to mind Michael Behe's famous irreducible complexity argument. What use would half a language ability be? But again, very plausible descriptions of possible evolutionary pathways to human language ability have been worked out. And I refer interested people to chapter 11 of Steven Pinker's very fine book, The Language Instinct. As with moral behavior, we don't know that human language arose naturally via natural selection, but natural selection offers some excellent explanations that we can test by future research. So I think that while there are some arguments for human exceptionalism, they're not necessary arguments. You don't have to believe them because there's no alternative. There are alternatives. Since the 15th century, when the modern age really got underway, our understanding of our place in nature has proceeded by a series of dethronements, of assaults against the notion of human exceptionalism. It turned out upon careful inquiry that no, our planet is not unique, nor is it at the center of the cosmos. It's only one of many similar bodies orbiting the sun. And then it turned out that the sun, as miraculous and majestic as it seems to us, is really only a rather ordinary object, one among billions like it, in a vast swirling disk of matter. An island universe, as they used to say. And then along came Edwin Hubble, and even our island universe turned out to be just one among billions. Darwin's insight and the synthesis they formed with genetics in the 20th century was another dethronement. And it's now clear to anyone who looks into the science that everything we know about humanity can be explained by taking us to be just another branch on the great tree of life. We may choose to believe differently. We may choose to believe that we are a unique creation infused with magical properties by a supernatural power. We may choose to believe that the many things we don't yet understand will be explained at last as magical and supernatural. But while we may choose to believe such things, we're not obliged to. There are good, sound, naturalistic explanations for most of the phenomena of human life. I was careful there to say most of the phenomena. The main exception, surely, is consciousness, for which there is, so far as I know, no really convincing naturalistic explanation. I've had a bet with myself for some time, after a number of exchanges with intelligent design people and creationists, human exceptionists. I've had a bet with myself that these people are very soon, and I think that I've seen some signs of it already, they're going to migrate away from evolutionary biology. As genetics advances, the pickings are getting very thin for exceptionalists in biology, in evolutionary biology. It's getting harder and harder to persuade anybody that Darwin was wrong. And I predict that the Discovery Institute and the Centre for Science and, what is it, the CCSCE, whatever it is, in the Discovery Institute that propagates the intelligent design arguments, I predict they're going to migrate to the neurology lab. We're going to hear much less from them about evolutionary biology and much more about the problem of consciousness, which is a real problem. That's a really hard problem, which we don't even have really plausible ideas about. So that's my bet. I think the exceptionists will soon conclude, if they haven't already, that anti-Darwinism is a lost cause. The pickings are much richer over in neuroscience. There are no real mysteries in evolutionary biology, whatever they tell you. Even where we don't know what's happening, we have good naturalistic explanations that we can try out. And we have the confidence that one or other of them will turn out to be correct. In neuroscience, by contrast, you have this very knotty problem of consciousness, which really is a mystery. One of the two really profound mysteries of the world we live in my opinion. The other one being the Big Bang. So there's my prediction. Any time now, the exceptionalists will stop boring us with their stupid peppered moths, Haeckel's embryos, and bacterial flagella, and they will start boring us with qualia, the explanatory gap, and the Chinese room. Start reading it up. Let me just now say, how much time do I have, Marcus? Sorry?
3 minutes.
About another 3 minutes, all right. Then I'm just going to say this. If I can find the right page. I'd just like to reflect for a moment on how odd it is that we're all talking about biology here. Nobody really expected this. When I was getting my education in England in the 50s and 60s, science was physical science. The bombs that went off at Hiroshima and Nagasaki made a very deep impression. Progress in science, we all supposed, would be most sensational in the physical sciences. Biology was a poor country cousin. I attended a secondary school where, after 1 year of evaluation, we were streamed, the best students were streamed into a liberal arts stream and a science stream. And in the science stream, we did physics, chemistry, advanced math. And we did a year of biology, but then you could drop it, and most of us did. The only ones who didn't were the ones who wanted to be doctors. It was very important. That was the mood in the 1960s. About that time, in fact, Isaac Asimov wrote an essay on science in the later 20th century, writing in the 1960s, the early 60s. Asimov said that the hot topic in science at the end of the 17th century was combustion. Everybody wanted to figure out combustion. The hot topic, I've just noticed that. All right. At the end of the 18th century, the hot topic was electricity. At the end of the 19th century, the hot topic in science was radioactivity. What, Asimov asked, would be the hot topic in science at the end of the 20th century? His answer, gravitation. We would all be starting in on gravitational technology, junking our cars and whizzing around in anti-gravity platforms, I suppose, something like that. Well, nice try, Isaac. But what has really got us all agitated in the 21st century is biology. We're not obsessing over the stress-energy tensor or Schwarzschild singularities. We're fretting over stem cells, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and the HAP map. Just one more point, if I may, Marcus. I think that the left and the right both have issues with this. It's come up suddenly like that. We didn't really think biology would be this important in 2000 AD. Oh, I beg your pardon, in AD 2000. It's caught us all a bit unawares. The left as much as the right. Steve Saylor, the best human science journalist working today, has encapsulated this in a very clever apothegm. Says Steve, the left believes in evolution, but not in biology. The right believes in biology, but not in evolution. Let me just unpack that a little. Biology there is shorthand for the idea that human beings are part of nature and that everything about us is susceptible to a natural explanation. So far so good as far as the leftist is concerned, but the leftist is nodding along with that, but he stops nodding when you say, oh, this understanding of human nature means that human beings have a fixed nature, or at least a core of fixed nature. We are not infinitely malleable. You can't make new Soviet man. You can't make us rustless cogs in a machine, which was an item of Mao Zedong's propaganda. You can't even make all our kids score above average in tests, as Teddy Kennedy's No Child Left Behind Act prescribes. And at that point, the leftist starts to lose his temper. Just so much biology, no more. The modern leftist mindset is essentially that the laws discovered by Darwin operated just as Darwin said they did up to about 70,000 years ago.
Time.
And then they stopped. At least for human beings.
Time.
Human exceptionalism, you see. All right, I have much more to say, but I'm going to yield to Tom, who no doubt will disagree with everything I just said.
Can you hear me all right? Is that better? Yeah, I do actually disagree with just about everything you said. So I think that human exceptionalism has got almost nothing to do with the critique, the intelligent design critique of Darwinism. That's actually kind of an old-fashioned idea which was summarized by the phrase the missing link, where I think in the 19th century some people who didn't know very much about science, religious people and so on, would say, well, I mean, you guys, Darwin, you know, you really know about science, this must be true, but we just do insist that there has to be some kind of a gap between apes and humans, and where we can say that we're different and God, there is a role for God somehow. That kind of an argument is absolutely not heard at all by intelligent people involved in criticizing Darwinism, people in the intelligent design movement. Incidentally, it's quite clear that there is a huge difference between creationism and intelligent design. If you explain to me, John, Darwinism, and I listen to you, the argument, the theory of Darwinism, and I listen to you and I say, well, I don't agree with that at all. Here in the Bible it says something completely different, and I believe the Bible, not what you say. That is creationism. If I say, wait a minute, if we look at these organisms, they are far too complicated to have evolved by any series of random accidental events, that is what the intelligent design people are doing. These are two very different things. Now, as far as I'm interested in this exceptionalism argument because you put so much emphasis on it. It plays just no role at all. If you could show how, and if it could be shown convincingly, how an ant evolves, how a spider evolved, how a mouse evolved from scratch, you would go a very long way to persuading me that human beings also evolved. I wouldn't have very much problem with those last few steps. Obviously, they're all related. Obviously, humans are mammals. They are part of this larger group. Obviously, they do all, in some sense, come out of the same factory. There are similarities, homologies that cannot be, and no one is attempting to deny. I was just actually in Detroit, as a matter of fact, last month, and one of the things I did was you can go on this tour where you see them making automobiles. Ford, and the Ford company has a tour that you can go on. Making an automobile today is a fantastically complicated operation. No one in the automobile industry, probably no one in the world, could tell you how many parts are involved, because the factories are all in different parts of the world, and the machines that make the machines and the robots and so on all have, it's just unbelievably complicated. And yet, the Ford, or whatever automobile you're talking about that emerges from this process, is simplicity itself compared to any of these organisms that I just mentioned. Can you imagine if Ford or General Motors were to come up with a male and a female car, and they could unite via the tailpipe or something, and a little car starts to grow, and then they become self-reproducing. Can you imagine how people would just marvel at that in the world of technology? This would be the most world-shaking thing, and we see this happening all around us all the time in the living world, and we just assume, oh well, we know how that happened. It just happened by a result of a series of random accidents, which is by mutation and natural selection. I'm sorry, but it's just not very convincing. The more we look at this, the more, you see, you say it's surprising that the interest in biology has increased. Let me tell you, I think maybe why it has. John wrote a very interesting article, which I recommend, on National Review online, called God and Me, about his waning faith. It was a very honest and readable and interesting article. His waning faith in God, which has been sort of replaced by a faith in science, I think. And he says one thing that just completely summarized my disagreement with him. He said, creationists, which of course he conflates with intelligent design people, are, quote, absolutely correct to hate and fear modern biology. Because the impression I think he believes that the more we look into this, the more we find, oh, well, that's obvious, we know how that worked out. He couldn't be more wrong about this. The fact of the matter is that all the research, it doesn't really matter, and he's also gone into the question that intelligent design people are not really interested in doing research, they're opposed to doing research, and he says that they're afraid of what the research is showing. All research that we are finding is suggesting that it is everything, when you get down to the molecular level, is getting more and more complicated, not more and more straightforward. Ernst Haeckel, a geneticist in the 19th century who was a great supporter and proponent of Darwin, referred to the cell as a simple little lump of protoplasm. Cell was also called a cavity by somebody else. It was a cavity filled with a homogeneous, transparent fluid. Biology at that stage was thought of as organisms were consisted of parts like Lego toys, a random variation or two, and you could just clip these parts together and they were just inevitably going to snap together the knee bone connected to the thigh bone. That's how they thought of it. And now, when they look inside the cell, I just noticed the latest issue of Science magazine has got a cover story on what's going on inside the nucleus of the cell. Just unbelievably complicated. The cell is now seen to be as complex as a high-tech factory, something in Silicon Valley. Now, it occurred to me as a kind of an analogy here. Look at a real Silicon Valley factory from 20,000 feet. Remember what I said, that Haeckel thought of it as a simple little lump of protoplasm. From 20,000 feet, you fly above Silicon Valley, you see these white rectangles. Simple little white concrete rectangles, that's all they are, those high-tech factories. That's about as wrong as thinking of a cell as being a simple little lump of protoplasm, which is what they thought in the 1850s. Now we know differently. Take the case of, there's someone who's writing on the web and has just come out with a book called The Design Matrix. His name is, he calls himself Mike Jean. There are some people in the intelligent design movement who know who this person is. I do not know. He does not want his name to be known. It is not going out because, of course, he's afraid of what will happen to him in his present position if it's found out. He has noted, and he talks about in this book, The Design Matrix, which has just come out, the exponential increase in the use of the phrase molecular machine, which is a lot of that in this latest issue of Science. So what we're seeing is a kind of fury and rage of the Darwinists, because they see what we are finding at the molecular level as it gets more and more complicated becomes harder and harder to explain in terms of Darwin's proposal of mutation, random mutation and natural selection. There has to have been somebody who designed this, or some way in which this was put together. Let me give another example. An intelligent design researcher called Doug Axe, who's been doing some work, who was at Cambridge and he got pushed out and is now being funded by the Discovery Institute. He is engaged in systematically varying the DNA sequences to see which ones produce functional proteins. Now, if the Darwin theory were true, you could change, you have a particular DNA sequence, a particular nucleotide sequence gives you a functioning protein. Let's just change one of those nucleotides. Maybe you get a little bit of the function. No, you don't get any of it. The analogy is, it's more like you don't find this being able to walk from one island to the other across this shallow sea. You just have this huge Pacific oceans of non-function separating the functional bits. You have to get it exactly right or it doesn't work at all. It's sort of like getting someone's email address. If someone gives you their email address, you don't just say, well, I got it about right. You've got to get it exactly right. Another thing that's been found, junk DNA. This is just recently coming out from the Human Genome Project. The junk DNA used to be considered 3 billion nucleotide sequence of nucleotide used to be considered that 98% of it was junk. It had all accumulated in the process of this trial and error, random mutation and so on, and it was all sitting there and we could ignore it all. It's like it's a 100-volume encyclopedia, 98 volumes of which we can completely ignore. Sorry, it turns out that it all has function. So this is a direct prediction, really, of Darwinism, which is in the process of being falsified by the Human Genome Project right now. Another problem with Darwinism, a central problem with the definition of Darwinism, is that the concept of fitness is undefined. The survival of the fittest, Darwin said. How do you define fitness? Well, it turns out to be the only way you can define it is by looking at the survivors. It therefore just simply explains, quote, in scientific terms, everything that exists. There is nothing that falsifies it. it's not really a scientific theory at all. It's a simulated explanation for what exists, and this is why Larry Arnhart and the whole idea of evolutionary psychology and so on is so wrong. Because you can explain every human trait that exists by Darwinism. Let's take passivity as a trait. All you have to do, how do you explain why we humans have this quality of being passive sometimes? Well, there's a gene for passivity. You posit that. You don't actually have to find it. Then you contemplate this, and you come up with a scenario in which being passive might be actually useful. Because if there's predators around and you're quietly, you survive better. So what about being aggressive as another quality? Well, then there's an aggressive gene. You don't have to find it. You posit a scenario in which that is helpful too. What about being passive-aggressive? Well, there's a gene for that too. It explains whatever you decide exists. This, incidentally, is why the left-wingers at Harvard, people like Gould and Lewontin, Richard Lewontin, objected to this, rightly so, because they're not really interested in human nature. In a way, the people on the left are interested more in what the human nature might one day be. They're interested in the way things could be, not in really very much in the way things are. So all this does is it gives you a sort of phony pseudo-explanation of things that exist. There are no counterexamples that you can posit, or no falsifications that you can come up with. If you can, I guess I would ask you this, John. I mean, can you think of anything in nature, any organism in nature, which would, natural structure in nature, which would cause you to clap your hand to your forehead and say, my God, that really, Darwinism couldn't possibly explain that. I don't think so. I think you'll find that the theory is can explain everything, which means it's not really a proper scientific theory at all. Invoking natural selection as the answer to everything that has been or can be discovered has recently, in the recent issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, criticized by an eminent professor at the University of Indiana, Michael Lynch, who said that it is not very different from the intelligent design philosophy, invoking, he is opposed to intelligent design, to invoke unknown mechanisms to explain all biodiversity. The burden of evidence for invoking the all-powerful guiding hand of natural selection should be no less stringent than the demands that are made of a creationist. So my feeling is that as we look into this more and more, it's all becoming harder and harder to believe that it happened by the simple procedures that Darwinism proposed. Darwinism, is really, and here's another point which is doesn't normally come up very much, but conservatives are sometimes told that they should accept Darwinism because of guiding principle behind it. The person who inspired it was, to some extent, was Malthus, in his who proposed, that there was competition between and it has been suggested that it was the competition that they saw in England between different companies competing with one another, which produced the survival of the fittest, which is what was the real sociological, as it were, background to Darwinism. Both Darwin and Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, who also came up with natural selection at the same time, both said they had been reading the same book by Malthus. But, capitalism really does work, and so we're therefore led to, the argument is made that therefore we should accept that Darwinism applies to the natural world just in just the same way. But I'm sorry, it doesn't. How much time? All right. I wasn't sure what order we were going to be speaking in, so I was going to say something about Ron Bailey, about his position of liberation biology.
A wonderful book, makes a great birthday, Christmas, Hanukkah present.
Okay. So he predicts that by the end of the 21st century, 90 odd years away, we will have family reunions in which 150-year-old great-great-great-grandmothers will be playing touch football. They will have good muscle tone, glowing and elastic skin, and after the game, the great-great-great-great will be discussing some academic discipline she studied 120 years earlier, with as much acuity as her great-granddaughter, who would also be there. We will be immune to diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's. The world will be greener and cleaner with natural vegetation, etc., more abundant. Our meals of salad greens fortified with nutrients and medicines needed to repair our damaged cells. Our bodies will be as athletic and our brains as clever as it is possible for brains and bodies to be. Now, when I read that, I thought, that's very interesting, because it reminded me of something, and I thought, wait a minute, what did that remind me of? And then I figured it out, remembered it, and here's what it reminded me of, and I'll read a passage and see if any of you can say who wrote this. Man will become immeasurably stronger, wiser, and subtler. His body will become more harmonized, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more musical. The forms of life will become dynamically dramatic. The average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, a Marx. And above these heights, new peaks will rise. Anyone know who wrote that?
Trotsky.
Trotsky. Right. But first, though, society would have to be collectivized. We'd have to go into a stage of collectivism. Well, we know what happened to Trotsky when that happened. And there would have to be no more private property.
Do you detect any collectivism in any of my writing?
No, not at all. I'm not saying you're coming from the same place as Trotsky at all. But it's, as I have written here, Bailey's utopia requires us to overcome his utopia requires us to overcome the reactionaries of the right and the naysayers of the left. People like Leon Kass, Francis Fukuyama, Bill McGibbon, Jeremy Rifkin, and so on. Also George Bush, I might say, although I don't think, because Ron is a good libertarian, I don't think that he has been calling for the federal funding of stem cell research. But incidentally, Ron, there's one point that you should have picked up on, and I think I'm being quite serious here. The real problem that's been holding back embryonic stem cell research is not money, it's access to eggs. Why don't you call for a free market in where women can sell their eggs? Because this is really what...
I have.
Yeah, oh yeah, okay, great. All right. Now, the older vision, the Trotsky vision, was really more radical. It involved the transformation of human nature. Whereas Bailey's vision is just simply the overcoming of aging and illness, and in that sense he really is a conservative, because he just wants to conserve kind of the best of what we have and keep it going for a longer time. But so what happened, I guess I can't go on with forever on this, but what happened was in the 19th century, you had the old idea of progress, which went on and eventually it kind of, and Darwin picked up on this idea too. You see, the whole notion of progress that was believed in the 19th century and the 20th century really resulted in, Darwin picked up all of that. John Stuart Mill and all these people were talking about the way human nature was going to be. People really believed in progress then. They believed that human nature was changing, everything was changing for the better. And now, people don't really believe that anymore. And I think that this is one of the reasons why evolution really is in trouble, because we just don't believe that change equals progress. We don't see it going on around us. We are aware of, all of the terrible things that happened in the 20th century. And it's, the best we can hope for is sort of what Ron Bailey is saying, is living to the age of 150 and being able to play touch football. But, and Ray Kurzweil is another one, taking 250 pills a day, says that people now in their 60s, there's hope for you, will live to the year 3000. Anyway, there's so much more to say, but I better stop there.
In interest of moderating and minimizing the competition, we can just refrain from. The purpose wasn't really to be a strict debate. I know everyone has little disagreements, so kind of, especially given that, you know, there was a slight imbalance in the number of people with different views, but we can try to limit the talk kind of on a more positive, proactive view, and then we can all get into it by going Q&A. We have Ron Bailey, who's the science editor of Reason, and the author of, as Tom mentioned, Liberation Biology, and Noble Health.
Well, I don't know how positive I'm going to be, but I'm not going to be talking about biological evolution because I'm not a scientist. I'm a scientist journalist. I hang out with biologists a lot, and I happen to read the scientific journals, and I wish Tom would read them a little more carefully than he apparently does. But then again, I would like to start my remarks, though, with a quick question, if I may. A couple of quick questions, a survey, if you will. I'm going to, and this is, I don't mean any disrespect, I'm just fascinated to see who's in the audience. How many people in the audience would consider themselves to be believing Christians? Would you raise your hand, please? Okay. How many of you believe that biological evolution is basically the way humanity came into existence? Okay. So there's a bit of overlap. Well, in fairness, I should give you my intellectual commitments along those lines. I am an atheist. I have been since I was a teenager, and it did all start with Darwin. And that will be relevant in my remarks. I'll explain that in a little bit. But then the question always puzzled me, and I became very fascinated by this issue, why people and the conservatives wanted to deny Darwin for some reason. Why do they want to deny biological evolution? And I'm going to just basically say, I'm not going to go into the evidence that anybody who claims that it's not true, biological evolution is not true, they're just flat out wrong. The evidence for the fossil record in genetics is just overwhelming. The notion of irreducible complexity is basically a refurbishment of the old God of the Gaps argument, which basically says that just because you can't imagine it, and I suggest to you that Tom has a very limited imagination.
I thought we were talking science.
We are talking science.
What's imagination got to do with it?
Because you can't imagine how something evolved, therefore you assume it didn't evolve.
Well, where's the evidence that it did?
I don't know, just hundreds of thousands of pages of scientific research, but that's just an aside. But so why do conservatives want to deny Darwin? All right, and the reason, this was something I read as an article quite a while back, actually. It was an article where this movement, intelligent design, first started infecting the conservative movement, and I was puzzled by this. Why were people so concerned about this? Well, the article was called, how shall I say, tendentiously enough, The Origin of the Species. It's still available online if you care to look at it. And it occurred to me when I started going into it that it had really nothing to do with the science. It had everything to do with religious and social concerns that the people were having. Now, there are two versions of this. There's the unsophisticated version, which is creationism, and the more sophisticated version, which we'll call intelligent design at this point. Now, as an example of the unsophisticated version, I had the great pleasure of attending the the Creation Mega Conference put on by Answers in Genesis at Liberty University back in 2005. And I have a few representative quotes that I would like to give you because it'll be relevant to why I think conservatives are concerned about this. But for example, in a talk given by Philip Bell, who is a former British cancer researcher and a full-time creationist now, his title of his talk was 8 Men, Missing Links, and the Bible. He explained to the audience, if Adam is your ancestor, then you were created specially and have a purpose in life. If evolution is true, we are descended from ape-like animals with no morality, no aesthetic sensibility, and no soul. Bell added that if evolution was true, you would have no purpose for your existence. In his welcoming remarks, the Reverend Jerry Falwell similarly declared to the audience, if we don't understand young Earth and how God created it in 6 24-hour days, then our values are skewed. If we believe that we evolved from a blob of protoplasm, we have 0 values then. If we evolved, there was no fall in the garden, and there was no sin and no need for redemption, and Christ's death was unnecessary and meaningless. Now, I hung out with the good folks at the Creation Mega Conference and talked to them quite a bit. Again, those articles are online. I hope you'll read them at some point. But it became very clear to me that what was concerning them was not the science. By the way, I did pick up a very nice copy of a book, lavishly illustrated, a children's book called The Dinosaurs of Eden, which I highly recommend if you have a certain macabre sense of entertainment. In any case, what was really concerning the people, and they were very nice people, I want to stress that, was that they were concerned that the biological evolution, the facts of biological evolution, were undermining their values, and that their moral beliefs would lead to lawlessness, family breakdown, homosexuality, pornography, abortion, and so forth. The real concern they had was existential dread. They were afraid that the world might be meaningless. All right, well, let's move to the sophisticated version, intelligent design. In the mid-1990s, I started noticing that some of the leading intellectual lights of the conservative movement were openly beginning to question the science of biological evolution. People like Judge Bork, a neoconservative, self-described, I guess we're not self-described, but sometimes described godfather to neoconservatives, Irving Kristol, and even Leon Cass, who, as you know, served as the head of President Bush's Council on Bioethics. And again, I will give you a few representative quotes. Bork, in his book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah, he writes, quote, that religious belief is probably essential to a civilized future. And he also celebrated in that book the fact that intelligent design was showing that religious belief could be confirmed. Leon Cass, in an article I think in First Things, wrote, the creationists and their fundamentalist patrons sense that orthodox evolutionary theory cannot support any notions we might have regarding human dignity or man's special place in the whole. And they see that Western moral teaching, so closely tied to Scripture, is also in peril if any major part of Scripture can be shown to be false. And Beverly LaHaye, who is someone, as you probably know, is a fundamentalist Christian, said, if we can't trust Genesis, what other parts of the Bible can't we trust? Just a more simple way she put that thought. Irving Kristol, in a 1991 essay, I believe in commentary, wrote, if there's one indisputable fact about human condition is that no community can survive if it is persuaded, or even if it suspects, that its members are leading meaningless lives in a meaningless universe. Kristol, by the way, this is not an insight that he had recently. He actually wrote this in an essay, very fascinating, I think, revealing long quote here. He wrote when he was discussing Freud in an essay he wrote in commentary 5 decades ago. And I quote again at length, if God does not exist, and if religion is an illusion that the majority of men cannot live without, let men believe in the lies of religion, since they cannot do without them, and let then a handful of sages who know the truth and can live with it keep it among themselves. Men are then divided into the wise and the foolish, the philosophers and the common men. And atheism becomes a guarded esoteric doctrine. For if the illusions of religion were to be discredited, there is no telling with what madness men would be seized, with what uncontrollable anguish. Again, existential dread. So I had, during my reporting on this particular article, The Origin of the Species, I sat down and talked with Irving over lunch at AEI. Very graciously we talked. And he outlined to me what he thought was going on there. And I quoted some of these things back to him. And he said, you know, Ron, and I quote, there are different kinds of truths for different kinds of people. There are truths appropriate for children, truths that are appropriate for students, truths that are appropriate for educated adults, and truths that are appropriate for highly educated adults. And the notion that there should be one set of truths available to everyone is a modern democratic fallacy. It doesn't work. All right, there are two things. There could be engaging in a kind of high-minded hypocrisy to protect people because they know what the truth is, and I think that may be what they're up to. But a less generous and charitable interpretation is that in some sense or other, they are, well, for lack of a better word of saying it, they're selling a kind of noble lie. We have to believe in religion because the little people wouldn't understand. And there's nothing about science. We're not arguing about science. We don't really care about the science. What we care about is making sure that society runs in the way we think it should run. Now, I agree with John Derbyshire here. The truth is first. And if conservatism cannot stand up to that, then so much the worse for conservatism. I also happen to believe that unlike some of these people, I don't think there are any dangerous truths. That in fact, truth will in fact illuminate the way human beings should behave toward one another increasingly and will help us to understand ourselves better and how we should behave toward one another over time. One of the things, I actually believe in the notion of progress, but I don't define progress in the silly way that was just done. Progress is basically the process of adapting our social institutions to match increasingly what our human nature is and allow it to flourish more fully over time as we better understand ourselves. It is not making us into new Soviet man. It is allowing us to become the free, flourishing people that we should be, and that unfortunately earlier societies did not allow people to do. And I think that in fact what you do find are people, other thinkers like Friedrich Hayek, for example, would find that this kind of notion is very vital to helping to us understand how human society can progress over time. So finally, I'll end with a little quote from Blaise Pascal in Conseils. According to St. Augustine and St. Thomas, when we meet with a passage, even in the scripture, the literal meaning of which, at first sight, it's a little complicated here, the literal meaning of which, at first sight, appears contrary to what the senses or reason are certainly persuaded of, we must not attempt to reject their testimony, that is, the testimony of our senses, in this case, and yield them up to the authority of the apparent sense of the scripture, but we must interpret the scripture and seek out therein another sense agreeable to that sensible truth. As scripture may be interpreted in different ways, whereas the testimony of the senses is uniform, we must in these matters adopt as the true interpretation of scripture that view which corresponds to the faithful report of the senses. In other words, what corresponds to what our human reason and science find out, not what we would like it to be. Or as he concludes, as St. Augustine says, of the infidels, if they find that we believed on the authority of Scripture in things which they assuredly know to be false, they would laugh at our credulity with regard to its more recondite truths, such as the resurrection of the dead and eternal life. And by this means, adds St. Thomas, we would render our religion contemptible in their eyes and shut up its entrance into their minds. I would hope that conservatives will not render their viewpoints contemptible in the eyes of the world by rejecting biological evolution. Anyway, thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Moy is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of a number of books, including the bestseller The Bell Curve, and also What It Means to Be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishment, and Losing Grounds. And go ahead.
Just pull it off.
Yeah, I think that's too far away.
Maybe that will work.
Well, it's close enough.
All right.
Well, I've been giving talks in various forums for 20-odd years, and I have never come to my turn with as little idea about what's going to come out of my mouth as I have right now. One of the things that's happened is that all of the panelists have stayed on point, which is unheard of in a panel like this. They have all talked about Darwinism and conservatism and the evolution, and I had sort of thought that they would wander far enough afield that I could somehow sound like I was being relevant to that discussion with my preconceived remarks. I can't. They have been too closely tied to a very interesting topic. And that leads to my second point. I can't remember the last time that I have listened to other members of a panel as attentively as I have, because I found all of their remarks really interesting. So I consider my role at this point that of the first questioner from the audience and the first ignoramus who doesn't really know anything about this, who's going to offer the views of the general public. Let me offer a couple that I hope people will respond to. The first has to do with the sin of hubris with regard to all of these topics in science. Who, at the beginning of the 20th century, talking about the universe, would have predicted that at the end of the 20th century, we would be looking at the universe we're looking at. Looking at a Big Bang theory, the very phrase of which, Big Bang, was coined as derision at such a stupid idea that there could be such a thing as a Big Bang. Who would have guessed that what would be our best understanding of the origin of the universe sounds a whole lot like Genesis's description of how the universe was born? Who would have thought that the universe was not only had certain things we didn't know about it yet, but that the more we learned about the universe, the weirder it got. I resonated with Tom Bethel's comment about the cell. I'm trying to think of an area of science, whether it's physics, or whether it's biology, or astronomy, any field in which things have gotten easier to understand over the course of the 20th century. On the contrary, it's all gotten weirder and weirder. And I would also then mention that one thought, which in my mind is the great haiku of thinking about the universe, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? Intelligent design is not something I spent a lot of time reading about, but the anthropic principle has captivated me. The anthropic principle refers to the ways in which the universe, if it were tweaked in the tiniest of ways, could not support life. And one of the most interesting books on this topic was written actually by Martin Rees, if I have the name right, the Astronomer Royal, who himself is an atheist. But he talks about the various mathematical aspects of the universe where we're not talking about life would be different if we tweaked certain things. We're talking about stars wouldn't have formed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, on the one hand, I'm entirely sympathetic with the notion that says, look, we exist. And so however unlikely it is that the sequence of events came about whereby we exist, we do. That I understand. It is also, though, true that if I were put in front of a firing squad and 6 guys with loaded weapons standing 5 feet away from me all fired and they all missed, I could at that point say, well, I'm still alive, so they missed. But it would also be reasonable for me to say, why? To inquire into what's going on here. I say this as preface to my one abiding religious conviction. To be a confident atheist is really silly. That any conception we have of God or how he works is so limited by our humanness that we can only strike out in the most clumsy kinds of ways to understand that. And so whereas atheism may be correct, to take the position of a Richard Dawkins and say, well, this is obvious, we can all know this, that is hubris on a very large scale. That's one set of observations which has, to me, in its political implications, simply this. Conservatives shouldn't get so worked up about the relationship of something like Darwin to their beliefs. Ron was saying he was an atheist as a teenager, and Darwinism played a role in that. I was an agnostic, I guess, as a teenager, but I could never understand why Darwinism should be that important one way or the other. Because it never occurred to me that a religious set of beliefs depended on a highly detailed understanding, human understanding of how the universe evolved. And that to say, oh, well, if Darwin is right, therefore Thomas Aquinas didn't have anything interesting to say, is a non sequitur of epic proportions. I think, however, that there is a set of things that are coming down the pike that come to a lot of the issues that John raised about human exceptionalism and about human nature. And in this regard, I think that not only is biology the most important of the sciences politically today, it is about to become of epic importance. And that has to do with the sense of human nature and whether it is malleable or not. The left has taken, I think, as a kind of fundamental principle every bit as deeply held as the fundamentalist view of the Bible, that human beings can be changed. That if you have the right social policies, if you do the right things, you can get rid of all sorts of problems that everybody wants to get rid of. I think that the evolution of science is coming at us like a locomotive saying that is not true. I don't even think very many people on the left really believe it anymore. I think they are whistling in the dark. I think they are hanging on by their fingernails, that the idea that human nature can be malleable in the way that they have wanted, that we can raise IQ, if you want to talk about an issue that I've written about, or that you can keep kids from becoming psychopaths if you have the right interventions. All the rest of that is about to go down the drain. I think also another set of things that are about to go down the drain within the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, as our knowledge of genetics increases, is the idea that groups of people are equal. And I don't care what groups you're talking about here. In the States, we get first upset about race, and then we get upset about gender. Hell, why not get upset about the differences between Italians and Dutchmen? There are differences between all kinds of groups that exist, that we can't change, and that also is going to be done. Well, at that point, it seems to me the conservatives have a particular kind of role to play, because the moral center of the view of the left has been that if you see inequalities among groups, if you see certain kinds of outcomes, that these can be fixed, and that group outcomes should be the same. If it were to become scientifically indefensible to take that position, if it were to become simply the same way as you can no longer say that the sun revolves around the earth, if you could no longer say that men and women should be equally represented in the sciences, to raise an issue that was particularly important to Larry Summers, if you could no longer defend that proposition, you have a central linchpin of moral philosophy of the left that has gone south. At that point, I think it is essential for conservatives, with what I think has been a much more realistic appraisal of human nature, to come forward and say, yes, there are genetically determined aspects of human nature. Yes, there are differences among groups. And what does that mean in terms of public policy? It means that we must morally, as an imperative, treat people as individuals. And we look at the person across the table from us and we treat that person who he is or who she is without regard to their membership in any group, without regard to anything except what we see before us. What worries me is that principle, which was so central to the founding of the Republic, and central to the founding of the Republic by men who were very realistic about the limits of human nature, has been lost on both the left and the right to a large degree. That there has been an idealism of libertarians which has been just as troubling as the idealism of the left. In my own experience, that recognition came about with the bell curve, where Ed Crane of the Cato Institute was just as unhappy about the bell curve as all sorts of people on the left, because libertarians would really like to think that, gee, our fate is within our own control and we can be whatever we want to be if we try hard enough. Just as the left would like to say, gee, if we only had the right social interventions, we could do all of these great things. So in that regard, if we're talking about political implications of the things we've been talking about tonight, I think they are real. I think they are about to become urgent within the next 10 or 15 years. And I think the responsibility of the people of the right is not to come up with any new bright ideas, but to cleave to the old. That individualism is the way a society should be organized, that individual freedom should be its guiding principle, and that we deal with each other not as members of groups, but as individuals dealing with other individuals. And that constitutes my haphazard first questions to the panel and first topics to raise with them.
Okay. Okay. I'd like to thank all the panelists once again, and originally we were going to plan to let each panelist ask a question for another panel, but because we got going a little bit late, I'm sure there's lots of people who would like to ask questions. And as the guy with the microphone, I think I'm going to take advantage of my position and ask a quick question. And I believe that Dr. Moy did kind of bring it up when he talked about the fixed aspect of human nature. And Mr. Bethell did talk about how why the left does not like evolutionary psychology is because they only want to talk about how things could be, while you alluded to something that you wrote about the future of what you think mankind can accomplish. I'd like to ask the three of you, what do you think, how fixed do you think human nature is, and whether it's through evolution or through another thing, how can it be changed, and if there's any important indications to that. So.
Well, I do think we are soon going to be able to change it. There's a great deal about that in Ron's book. We'll be able to change human nature with things like neuropharmacology and genetic engineering. Whether we'll do that wisely is a question I'll leave aside. We don't usually start off doing things wisely, but after a century or so, we generally get the hang of them. I personally am quite sympathetic to the idea of the singularity. I don't know if you have any singularitarians here. The broad idea is that at some point, a few decades hence, either our manipulation of living tissue, our manipulation of the genome and of the human brain will advance to the point, or our clever little machines will get so clever that they advance to the point where we, me, you, anybody in this room who's around, will be sharing the planet with much more intelligent beings than ourselves. And at that point, that's what what's his name, Kurzweil, calls the singularity. In mathematics, a singularity is what happens when you try to divide by zero. Everything shoots off to infinity, and you can't say anything coherent about what's happened. Well, that's his idea. If that point arrives, and I think Kurzweil, the last time I saw, he put it at 2045. This is going to happen in 2045, according to him. When that happens, all bets are off, and there isn't anything that you can say about what happens after. It's like the Big Bang, except in the other direction in time. Because the beings that we're sharing the planet with then will be so much more intelligent than ourselves, we really have no idea what they'll be thinking about or what they'll be doing. I do think there's probably something in that. I am, by ideological inclination, I'm what Steven Pinker calls a Mysterian. I think about my own brain, little 40 ounces of soggy matter trapped there in my skull. What Samuel Beckett called the ring of bone. And I say to myself, you know, how much can this really understand about the world? Probably not very much. If we can engineer ourselves or our clever little machines to a point where they understand much more than we do, then indeed we'll be in a very strange and different world. So I would even go beyond what Ron talks about in his book. Ron talks about enhancing what we already have, making ourselves smarter, giving ourselves better memories, and so on, which is certainly just over the horizon, I agree with him. But I think just over the further horizon, I do think something like the singularity is waiting for us, and then all bets are off.
Time.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I don't believe this. I think Kurzweil is just, all of this stuff is wishful thinking, including 150-year-old great-great-grandmothers playing touch football. It ain't going to happen. I mean, that's, you know, it's prediction, and mine is a prediction, and neither of us is going to be around to find out. Kurzweil's prediction is actually coming quite soon. He's predicting that computers will reach human-level intelligence within about 20 years, I believe. And I'm quite sure that that's not going to happen either. All of this, all of these things turn out to be far more complicated, and just tinkering with computers is getting nowhere. I wrote a whole article about the search for artificial intelligence, about how they had this conference in 1956, and how they thought they were going to be able to solve the whole problem of create artificial intelligence. This was in 1956, that it would take one summer with them. One summer they would be able to get it done. And they haven't been able to get anywhere really with it. And, you know, I interviewed John McCarthy at Stanford, and he admitted, you know, that they were just all completely wrong. It's, you know, what humans, a 2-year-old child knows millions of things, and they don't know how it happens. I mean, there's a program, there's a thing called Psych, Douglas Lynat, where they're trying to instill or teach or put into a computer all of these millions of things. You know, it's absolutely inexhaustible. I mean, if you hold it, one of them is that a child knows that if you have a glass of water, you have to hold it that way up, not the other way up. Computers don't know that. And if you think of things like that children automatically do, and automatically know when they have never been taught any of them, you realize that there is something far more mysterious about what's going on. To get more directly to the question about human nature, I did look into this when I was writing my book on private property, because in the 19th century, these people like John Stuart Mill were talking about how collectivism or socialism wasn't really possible given the current state of human nature. But in the future, of course, it will be much better, because human beings are evolving. And I figured what it is, the feature of human nature that makes communal property impossible is simply the faculty of reason. Because you can reason if you're in a commune and you're not doing any work, and somebody else, you're not doing the work, and you're entitled to a certain percentage of the product of that commune, that everybody has an incentive to be idle. And it just doesn't work, and you cannot overcome. It's very, very difficult to overcome that. The only way you can overcome it is in a commune where you have basically got monks who don't have children or families, and they're all, you know, you can sort of overcome it. But for people with families, you can't overcome it. So this is an aspect of human nature that will, central aspect of human nature, the faculty of reason itself, which is what we talk about human nature, is not going to change. It's going to stay the same. It's not going to be reformable.
I'll be very quickly. I agree that there is a fixed human nature, and if you're interested in my views about how we might be changing that technologically in the future, please read Liberation Biology. But one of the things that you also have to think about, for example, what Tom was just talking about, private property and devotion to family and that kind of thing, those are kinds of things that we have another technology, a cultural technology out there that try to teach us not to put them first. And it's called religion, where you have things like the Golden Rule. And it is a countervailing, if you will, cultural technology to try to not have us go along with a prior type of nature which stresses family over, or if you will, kin selection, as they might say in biological evolution. So you have to think about it. What we are trying to do is adapt our society over time to our nature, I think, by, unfortunately, because human beings are terrible at foresight, and I admit that I can't predict that people will be living 150 years in the year 2100, but we'll see. And put it this way, I hope I'm around to buy you a drink. But in any case, what will happen, what is happening is that we are learning more about ourselves over time in a Hayekian trial and error way, and adapting our institutions to fit that nature over time. I now think that the 21st century we're going to start adapting our natures ourselves, and whether that'll be wisely done or not is another issue. What is absolutely most crucial about this is that those decisions about how people adapt their natures and the nature of their descendants should never, ever be in the eugenic hands of the government under any circumstances. But that's another topic for another day.
Bill?
I think Murray wanted to say something.
Well, real quick, because this does bear on something I do know something about, and that is IQ. there is a correlation between IQ and a whole variety of social behaviors. So on the one hand, you can look at a variety of ways in which humans have not changed over the millennia. I think the Nicomachean ethics remains just about as perceptive and understanding of human beings and what gives human beings enjoyment and the rest of it. I mean, Aristotle nailed it, and we're still the same in one sense. It is also true that a society of people that have a mean IQ of 95 and one that has a mean IQ of 105 behave in very different social ways. Different enough that even though you can say that there is human nature that is constant across the whole range, that the social arrangements that are possible in different kinds of communities with different kinds of human capital are quite different. And that's just simply a fact that will have to be taken into account as we think about social arrangements.
Bill?
There's one aspect of this that I'm surprised I haven't read more about, and maybe just because I haven't read everything all of you have written. But that is that if things like intelligence and athleticism and other factors that we regard as making one person better in some sense than another are in fact hardwired, it's also equally true that they're passed on genetically. And that means, for example, that two extremely intelligent people are more likely to produce an intelligent child than two extremely non-intelligent people, notwithstanding regression to the norm and so forth. That's true, what I said. And it's also possible, so that means that genetic selection of the old-fashioned kind, just causing the most athletic people and the most intelligent people to breed more, to spread their genes more broadly, would seem to be an effective technique for raising the intelligence or the athleticism or whatever else you're interested in for a society. And we now also have the possibility of genetic intervention, that you don't necessarily have to get a bright man and a bright woman. You just kind of play with the genes in the egg, and you create an intelligent person. If all that is true, how long can it be before certain societies, like North Korea or somebody, just decide as a matter of policy that they're going to go for that, and they're going to, take the sperm of the top 5% of the most intelligent men in society and pay women to have children with those sperm, who are going to engage in the most dramatic and revolutionary and risky genetic interventions in the genes of children who haven't yet been born in order to produce above average people. I can't believe that at some point you're not going to see a breakout of that kind in certain societies. And as someone said, to do that in a systematic way that would make a big difference would probably require some government intervention and some government involvement. Have any of you given any thought to whether that might happen, or why it might never happen, or if it did happen, what we would do about it?
It's against human nature. People don't allow their families to be created in that way. There's a totalitarian pipe dream of the worst leftist sort that's been going on, and now some people on the right seem to be adopting it oddly, and I don't understand that. I recommend highly my buddy Jonah Goldberg's new book on liberal fascism if you'd like to get a good sense of the sorry history of eugenics.
So it can't happen.
I don't think so.
There was a sperm bank of
And it
Nobel
failed.
Prize winners, and it failed. It
Yeah.
didn't produce anybody extraordinary.
Yeah, and that's true, and I agree with Ron's. I mean, people want to have their own babies, and to talk about a genetically hardwired thing, we want to have our own babies. However, if you have affluent parents right now who are spending 30 grand a year on private school and thousands on SAT preparation courses, and you have a genetic intervention that would raise their kids' IQ by 5 points, just what proportion of those affluent people do you think would spring for it? I'd say 100, because there is a real sense, I think, among a lot of people, and I sympathize with it in a way, which says, well, we want the child to be our own child in terms of color of his eyes and his personality and this, but we can make him smarter, let's do it. And here I've become very nervous because we human beings are so bad at seeing the long-term effects of our bright ideas that we have in the short term. So I'm optimistic with Ron that the totalitarian approach to this will not occur. I am pessimistic about, in the short term, of all the really stupid things that we're likely to do once genetic interventions become available, thinking that, well, this can only produce a good result. We don't have to worry about bad side effects, and there will be bad side effects.
Yeah, just one comment on, you said neglecting, discounting reversion to the mean. But that is exactly the experimental outcome when you try to do this. I mean, they have been trying to get fruit flies to become something other than fruit flies for 100 years now in labs, where they bombard them with X-rays and they take the ones that have the most extreme of whatever it is and try to push them off the envelope of variability to become something else, and they never do. They always just either become infertile or revert to the mean. This is the experimental.
I'll give you an example.
Okay, well, give us.
For example, among other things, I've created fruit flies that live 200 days, which is about 10 times longer than average fruit flies do. And that is a huge change, that they don't revert back to living 20 days. They would only do that if they return to the original environment, which is why, you must understand the biology better than this.
It's still fruit flies, right?
But they play touch football.
I'm sure they have other pleasures of fruit fly-ish sort.
I'm sorry, Ron, I don't accept that. You're going to have
Of course not.
You're going to have to give me the citation to the literature. My understanding
Easily done. I'll send it to you
that
tomorrow.
fruit flies have remained fruit flies, and that's all they have ever. They have all they've ever been able to get them to become.
And of course, there's the example of the fruit flies in Hawaii, which I'm sure you will discount, but the fact that they can trace back through genetic testing, that it appears that a single pair of fruit flies appeared there at one point and now speciated into over 1,000 different kinds of fruit flies. But I don't think that'll count either, because they're still fruit flies, even if they're not interbreeding, right? You redefine the terms as you want to do it.
Could I just clarify? A lot of people might be baffled by this term regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is a very well-known statistical phenomenon, but in this context, it means the mean of the breeding population. If you have a breeding population, if you segregate off a lot of very, very smart people and only let them breed amongst themselves, you'll keep getting very smart people. If you segregate off a bunch of very smart people and let them breed among themselves for a while and then throw them back into the general population, they will regress to the mean of the general population. It's the mean of the breeding population that you regress to. Hope everybody understands that.
This question is for Charles Murray. I was just wondering, when you're talking about, we find these differences among people and among groups, and then you say that we should treat them, you use a couple different terms about kind of
Individuals.
democratically, individually, but they're in ethical ways. If this Darwinian story, is true, I mean, how do we ground those things? Getting back to this kind of concern that Ron Bailey was talking about, this kind of angst. I mean, how do you personally ground? In other words, why not just say, well, we shouldn't treat them as individuals. We should treat them as part of a group. I mean, where it can't be found in nature. So where do we find that? I just don't. For you personally, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's a matter of personal philosophy that I do not want people to look at me and assign me a variety of group memberships and think they know one damn thing about me. They don't. Why should I do that with anybody else?
There's no cosmic imperative. It's just like I wouldn't want them to do that to me. It's in other words, a preference rather than a norm.
It's a hell of a good preference, is my view.
I agree.
But see, I don't know what I guess if I get back to natural rights, and which I do think come very close to being a norm, which in my view, human beings are born with ownership of their own bodies, and the rest of the natural rights argument, which I think is a norm. it seems to me that if you start from those principles, it becomes in some very closely related way unethical to treat other people as anything except the individuals who they are. So I can't do it for you right now, but I think there is probably a line to be drawn from very basic premises about natural rights to treating people as individuals under the circumstances I described.
Could I just say that I think that's hopelessly idealistic, Charles?
I've been accused of that before, yes.
And may I be the voice of reason? So to speak. One other way that I like to look at it is that what we have done is we can look back over, we've had lots of examples of other societies where people were not treated equally, where there were slaves, where women were treated as in purdah, where they were kept, could not own property, had no rights. And we look, and there was something amazing happened in the Western world, and there are lots of different theories about this, where people started treating people better over time, and they started treating them more as equals over time. And what did we see then? We saw the flowering of the technologies that we see here. The population grew enormously in the West first because of this. It was, in a certain sense, an evolutionary success. And more people wanted to move to those societies, and more people were choosing those kinds of societies over time. Now, I think that means that it is fitted to human nature, and that we have discovered that as a fact. And that's why that norm works. If you want to go back, the norm works because people prefer it, not because the other societies were successful in some sense. They were successful, they persisted, they eventually ended up as our society, but let's face it, up until 2 centuries ago, the natural state of humanity was abject poverty. Fortunately, 1 billion people no longer live in abject poverty, and with good hope in the end of the 21st century, everybody will be out of abject poverty.
Yes, I just wanted to say that while the principle of legal equality and constitutional equality is a very sound one, which I don't disagree with, I very strongly doubt, Charles, that you can treat people as simply as individuals and never as members of groups. And I don't think you should. I think it would be foolish of you to do so. For example, you're an elderly widow. You have a room to let in your house. 2 people come to look at the room, and they both like it and they both want to rent it. One of them's a young black guy with dreadlocks, and the other one's an elderly Japanese woman. Which one are you going to rent it to, Charles?
No, that's fair. You are faced with decisions with incomplete information. All right? And so when you have incomplete information, you bring to bear the best bets you can. And that's true if you're picking stocks or whether you're picking people to rent rooms to, or whether you're playing poker hands. But that doesn't negate the nature of the obligation. So that, for example, 2 people coming up to try to rent my room, and under the normal amount of time and latitude I have to interview them, I will use group characteristics to influence my decision. Absolutely right. Does that mean that it would not be better in a moral sense if I could treat them as individuals? No. It just means that there are exigencies in life, and you have to deal with the exigencies. It doesn't change the moral principle.
Isn't it also true that when you have more information, say when you're interviewing people for jobs, that just because somebody is from a group with a certain, say, an intelligence, that says nothing about the particular individual sitting in front of you from that group, which is to say you can't tell anything about an individual's abilities from the group to which they belong.
But in the presence of incomplete information, you then make bets. So that I was delighted when I went to see my new cardiologist and found out that he was East Asian. And it was young. Because young is good, medicine, they've been keeping up with the literature. East Asian is good, they work their asses off and are smart. And I was making stereotypical generalizations, but in the presence of incomplete information, that was better. I had better odds than if I hadn't used that.
Yes. And actually, I need to preface this with 3 of my favorite writers in all of writing are sitting right here, and I'm sorry I don't know the gentleman in the green shirt, but
speak up. And
Oh, I'm sorry. The camera. Okay.
We don't have 5 minutes footage of your backside.
Mr. Derbyshire, we have exchanged emails about hobbies and then, and I love the National Review. And Mr. Bailey knows from all of his interaction he's had with me on his, on Hit and Run over at Reason, that I'm a big fan of his. And sir, you have no idea what a big fan of yours I am. The only thing that was really puzzling about this whole thing, and perhaps I missed something, in the three of you to the right of Mr. Derbyshire is, do you three guys believe or disbelieve that human beings are actually a part of nature? And and if possible, I'd like you to respond individually if we have enough time.
Yes, I do believe that.
Sorry.
Oh, absolutely, there's nothing else.
Me too.
Okay, that's okay, great, thanks. Thanks, guys.
Okay. David?
Oh, wait a minute, can we get David Weigel's impression? Where'd he go?
I was actually just wondering, Mr. Derbyshire, what you felt about, I mean, I appreciate your view on the coming robot wars, which we will have to prepare for, but don't you think that there's a bit of a problem when you have people criticizing intelligent design because it's not scientific enough, and then making claims that themselves can't be scientifically supported aside from hypothetical perspective? I'm actually,
which claims?
well, here I'm talking about random selection.
Random selection? What is that?
Oh, sorry, natural selection, excuse me.
Natural selection.
That is not guided at all.
I don't see any need for the hypothesis that it's guided. It seems to me to be a coherent theory without that hypothesis. And so you apply Occam's razor and say, we don't need this hypothesis. Does that meet the case?
That's fair.
Kevin?
Question for Dr. Berman. Taking as a given that pure absolute egalitarianism as far as groups are concerned may start to fall apart over the next 10, 15 years as more information comes in. Isn't it also true that certain studies in sociobiology may start to indicate that human beings have, some might say, irrational or even moral group preferences, or kinship, or preferring their own ethnic groups, and that this might even be stronger outside the West? Steve Saylor talks about this quite a bit, I believe, about how other societies tend to show greater importance toward extended kinship groups than we do. So is there a danger then that, truth is our highest standard, it might not just be egalitarianism that comes under attack, but also individualism?
Yeah, and one of the leading examples of that comes from Putnam, the guy who did the Bowling Alone book 7 years ago, and recently came out with another book which he published with great anguish because it indicated that in mixed neighborhoods you have not only less trust across but across groups, you also have less trust within groups. It's a very depressing book, and it leads to it seems to me, it is consistent with our intuitive sense that our blood is thicker than water in terms of the immediate family, the nuclear family, and then there are kinships with groups and so forth. And these fall under the category of things about human beings which are true, and I think it is foolish to try to deny them, and also things about human beings which are problematic. One of the defects of the enthusiasms of the left has been that it's made it hard to take a middle ground. The middle ground here is that no, we can't shape human nature to be the way we want it to be. It's also okay to say, you know, here's an aspect of human nature which is really problematic, and we ought to do what we can to ameliorate it. And I would say that it's it's instinctive and natural and hardwired and so forth for there to be these kinds of kinship relationships, and also that they can very easily lead us astray. And one good reason to be a libertarian is that the way that we want to structure the world is to make it as hard as possible for people to use coercion in giving an advantage to the groups they happen to prefer. They can go ahead and prefer all they want. If they want to live only with other Italians, and they're Italian, that's fine. What you can't do is you can't coerce other people into sharing your predilections.
Yes, let me preface this by saying I do believe in evolution, in Darwin's theory of evolution. But two people, at least here, Derbyshire and Bailey, said that the question of whether evolution is correct is a factual question. It can't be decided on its consequences, but only on the factual basis. I notice that nobody seems to have taken up the factual objections to Darwinian evolution. It's certainly clear that the fossil record shows that in some fashion macroevolution has occurred. It certainly does not show that it has occurred by natural selection. It does not show that at all. In fact, Darwin in his book points out that the strongest objection to his theory is that the intermediate forms are not present and not found in the fossil record. It's now 150 years later, and they still haven't been found in the fossil record. It's a very serious objection. Another objection was, one of you mentioned, I forget which, said the cell is so complicated and organisms are so complicated, how could this have arisen by chance mutations? And my answer would be, of course, given enough time, you could do it. But if it took 40 million years of evolution to get the heel hit this to the horse, it would seem that to develop from inorganic matter to a simple cell should take a couple trillion years. And to get from that cell to a human being should take a few trillion more, or maybe it's quadrillion. And nobody here seems to have addressed the factual objections, which are really there. Now, you might ask, why under those circumstances do I believe in Darwinian evolution? And I can't prove it. It explains a lot of things. It fits in with pre-existing prejudices I have, but I can't say it's a fact, or even that it's a scientific theory, the way the general theory of relativity is a scientific theory. You can't make any real predictions out of this. So why has nobody addressed it, I suppose, is the question.
Well, the whole problem with that is that you can't do it briefly. I have an escape hatch here, just let me get to it. In any kind of meeting with people like Tom, you try to avoid, and I think Tom probably agrees with this, you try to avoid getting down into the dust with particular points of objection to biological theory, because then the meeting lasts for 18 hours, basically. I would like to say it's not true we don't have intermediate forms. We have lots of intermediate forms. You talked about Eohippus to the horse. We have, you could check this, and I'll tell you where to check it in a minute. It was 58 million years, as I remember, and you have about 10 genera, 50 or 60 species, all in the fossil record. So it is not true that we don't have intermediate forms. We have lots of intermediate forms. But you see, once you start picking away at points like that, people are pulling out their textbooks and saying, you know, page 417 of Professor Schlosselmeyer's thesis says, and he said, no, it doesn't say. We have to keep, in a forum like this, we have to keep things at a fairly general level, I'm afraid. But now I'm going to tell you where to go if you want answers to specific points like this. The National Council for Science Education has a very good website called talkorigins.com, which has good search facilities and good indexes and really good essays about the finer points that we don't really have time to chew over here. It's called talkorigins.com. I recommend it to you. And one of the beauties of it is that amongst its other links, it has a whole page of links. There were more than 300 the last time I looked, to creationist and intelligent design websites. A courtesy that the intelligent design people do not reciprocate. If you go on the Discovery Institute website, you will not find a link to Talk Origins. But Talk Origins does link to all the people who disagree with it. It's a very good website. I recommend it.
Here, here.
Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that. My name's Edward Sisson. I think this gentleman was absolutely correct. You all may be familiar with the Kansas evolution hearings in 2005. At that time, I was a partner at Only Porter, and my assignment in those hearings was to cross-examine the science witnesses for the mainstream theory. The Kansas State Board of Education set aside 3 days for the challengers to testify and 3 days for the mainstream side to testify. We presented some 17 witnesses, including 10 university PhD scientists. The mainstream side boycotted, and so I was sort of the bride at the altar. Now we see that a similar issue is brewing in Texas. And there was a story just yesterday about someone in the Texas Education Department being fired. And clearly this issue is going to come up again. If Texas schedules several days in which the mainstream science side can present its witnesses to testify subject to cross-examination, would you urge the mainstream science side to present its witnesses?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, but I should also point out we're having dueling cases. There was the Dover, PA case where, in fact, the Discovery Institute pulled out rather than face mainstream scientists. So that's...
May I respond?
Of course.
I'm not associated with the Discovery Institute, but there is a gentleman here who is, and I believe that's a mischaracterization, number one. Number two, in the context of that case, the subject under discussion was not the validity and weaknesses of the evolutionary theory, but whether the intelligent design theory could compete with it as a scientific theory. My question focuses on the weaknesses in the mainstream theory as a target for cross-examination.
We only have a couple of minutes, so I think we'll have to move on.
Now, I'm just curious whether you all would support scientists coming to testify in the cross-examination.
15 minutes. 15 minutes is good.
Okay. Jim? Yep.
Let's see, two other things. One is that maybe to my one point of clear agreement with what Mr. Bethell said is I run an artificial intelligence software company, so I will bet anyone in this room, and I'll give you 10 to 1 odds, that we will not have a computer in the year 2027 that can reason at the level of human being.
That will what?
It will reason at the level of human being.
Okay, I'm not
There's
taking
no
that
possible
back.
way that is going to happen by the year 2027. I guess the second question is, to all the panelists, at least John I know knows, I did an article a couple months ago with National Review on the question of evolution, and it seems to me that conservatives keep getting suckered into the same dynamic, which is they get convinced that scientific finding X implies political or moral conclusion Y. In this case, I think broadly, and I think John's right about this, you know, if I accept the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology, therefore I conclude that, you know, I must be an atheist, and you know, all these conclusions of the meanings of nice reflect the truth. So I guess and I don't believe that's true, and that was the point of the article, that regardless of whether the modern synthesis is correct, it does not imply, as my argument, that I must draw these philosophical conclusions. So I guess to each of the panels have an opinion. Is it your view that accepting the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology implies that I must be an atheist?
Not at all. I think it's irrelevant.
I should say I'm an atheist the same way I'm a unicornist. If you show me a unicorn, I'll believe in it. If you show me a God, I'll believe it. And that's where my atheism is, so no.
I would say no, but on the other hand, I would say if Darwinism in its strict form is true, it delivers quite a blow to religious people. I would argue that. I mean, Dawkins more or less takes that. I mean, he disavows the middle ground, the Neville Chamberlain school of evolution. And in a way, I don't agree with Dawkins about much, but I think that he has a point there.
I'm Neville Chamberlain.
I would answer yes and no. Yes, I forget which way around to answer, but yes, I would say it. I agree with Tom, and I agree with the thing that Tom quoted that I had said, that modern biology, the synthesis of Darwinism and genetics, really does strike a body blow against religious belief, certainly against the Abrahamic religions. On the other hand, I don't think you could prove metaphysically, I don't think you could prove by pure logic that if you believe in this, you must be an atheist. No, I don't think so. There are ways to finesse it so that you can hold both beliefs in your mind without going nuts. But, I say again, ultimately, modern biology is and will increasingly be dangerous to religious belief.
Don't agree.
I don't agree.
I was struck by Marcus's question, can we change human nature? And that would seem to be a consensus that we have a human nature. It seems to me Darwin goes directly against that notion. If human beings did not exist at one time and they evolved, it means their nature was created over time. If what we often mean by human nature is that which cannot be changed. If we can change human nature, then what is it about us that is us? A practical example on the left these days is most people think people are born male and female, and that seems to fit a Darwinian pattern. If you believe, as some do, that you can change it at will, and a man can become a woman can become a man, and back and forth, then it's not part of your nature. It's part of what you may or may not accept about you. The same issue goes toward orientation. But if we can change something about us, it's not our nature. It's something we may have thought was our nature. And I think this existential dread that Ron Bailey spoke about is why it's so disturbing. Because if we have no nature, what's the point of our thinking we're somebody of any consequence? So it may not affect the factual science of it, but it's very hard for humans to get out of that same box. Somewhat related to Charles Murray's point about he accepts if we have limited information, we have to make decisions. Well, the fact is human beings always, all the time, have only limited information, and we're required to make decisions about all kinds of things, from getting up in the morning to fighting great wars. So to have a morality based on unlimited information is a morality which sounds nice, but has nothing to do with human nature.
But it's an immorality that can affect behavior. The question asked earlier, when I'm sitting across the desk from somebody, if they may be a member of a group, but I don't know what their ability is, it was absolutely true. That is also true, I can make statistical probabilities, but if I'm hiring an employee, and that person sitting across the table, and there are ways for me to acquire more information, there are A, moral reasons to say that's the appropriate thing to do, as opposed to saying I'm going to go with statistics, and B, there are also very empirical, practical reasons to get more information, because the accuracy of your decision will be much higher. So you take the combination of the empirical advantages and also the moral appropriateness of gaining more information, and I think you've got a workable way for making the world a better place.
You're saying more, but not complete.
Never complete.
John Derbyshire, Institute for Humane Studies. My question to you would be, based on kind of the Hayekian argument about markets, that of billions of people interacting together kind of on a micro level create macro order without design, why would that not apply also in a biological way? Why would we need, his argument is that the complexity, the irreducible complexity, proves that we can't have design because no one could design this complex system, right? Why would that not also apply on the biological scale?
Because in the human social level, if you come up with some innovation or some new idea, you can immediately communicate it to me. I can understand it. It can be this sort of horizontal transmission of that idea, and I can then adapt to what has happened. But that's essentially Lamarckism. You know, that you can learn, that the genome can learn from experience. I mean, that just simply doesn't happen. It has to be the right thing has to happen before it can be selected from. This is the problem. This is why there are these huge improbabilities.
We have time for 2 more questions.
No, one more.
No more.
Oh, you're just mean.
Just real quick,
Yeah.
this might be a good way to end it. I personally have never found it difficult to reconcile evolution with religious belief. I look at it as, if religion is concerned with the spirit and the soul and you said the consciousness to some degree, then why do I care how my physical body got there? And the Bible, to me, more or less is a way of reading and then peering into human nature through the context of what people learned over time. But do you think, and you talked about the sin of hubris, do you think that this could be similar to, say, and the Greeks saw that as a huge sin, hubris. So that was the destruction of all small nations, would be hubris. And in Oedipus Rex, his constant inquiry into why he was king eventually led to him gouging his eyes out and not wanting to see the ugliness. That was the reason. Do you think perhaps that we're going to get to a point as a society, and in science, that we have peered into this to the point and gone so far that we would rather just blind ourselves than to deal with the facts of the truth? To anybody who wants it.
Well, in this regard, I'm an optimist, and I ally myself with John, and well, I guess I ally with all three. You know, the truth shall set us free in a variety of ways, and I just cannot imagine. Let's stipulate, for purpose of argument, that there is a God. I think one of Aquinas' most brilliant insights was that God, if he's worthy of being a God, delights in his marvels being understood by human beings. And so I have no fear whatsoever of advancing knowledge in this field.
But may I say, let's postulate that there is no God. Are you going to run out and murder your wife, your children? Are you going to start? No. I mean, folks.
Depends on the wife.
No, well. but the point is that they stipulate. What you're talking about is compatibilism, and again, it's arguable. I mean, the great thing. My religious problem was, as a teenager, I had a Methodist Sunday school teacher who couldn't explain Genesis and Darwin. Had a nice Jesuit, I might still be a Christian, you know. The problem is that the Jesuits know how to do and understand and interpret Scripture properly, quote unquote. And again, the Catholic Church doesn't seem to have much problem with this, and that's why I was quoting Augustine and Thomas.
I want to clarify a little bit. I guess what I meant by the ugliness at the end when you were talking about.
I understand. Also, I actually don't think that human existence is tragic. I don't have that vision.
There's just one point I wanted to make in response to the point you made. Why is there not more skepticism about Darwinism in view of all of these various problems? And I'm not just making some kind of final put-down point about it. I think the real issue here, and it's very important, we haven't come up with it, is if evolution is not true, we are all here. How do we get here? How else did we get here? There must have been some kind of intervention in the physical in space-time from something outside space-time, and scientists tend to take the view that all causes have to be material. And so we've adopted this sort of ideology or philosophy of materialism, but all causes have to be material, so evolution sort of has to be true by definition in a sense. This is one of the big problems that I think is going to come up in the philosophical discussion between evolution and intelligent design.